We've covered a number of historical murders on this channel, but so far none have been as tragic as the one I bring you today, both due to the age of those involved and the reason, or should I say lack of reason for it. It's a story that gives virtually no satisfactory answers, only more, now, unanswerable speculation. But it is an interesting story and one that needs to be told. Although she would go down in history with her married name, Catherine was born Catherine Morley, sometime in June 1829. An exact date has been lost to history. She was born and raised in the Suffolk village of Acton. Her father was William Morley and her mother Maria, who worked as the village washerwoman. She would have a very basic level of education, going to a charity school in the village, and it seems she did not take well to this education, being widely described as simple-minded as she grew up. Few details of her early childhood survive, only that she was a quiet and very withdrawn child, who didn't make friends easily, and on at least one occasion had expressed to her mother that she hoped she died young. At the age of 11, in 1840, her family moved into a thatched farmhouse that had been split into 3 separate sections for different families. The building itself still stands today in Acton. The exact reason for this move is unknown, but from this point onwards the only parent involved in her life seems to be her mother. So it is quite possible that William and Maria had parted ways sometime in her younger years, leaving her alone with her mother and 2 younger siblings, Thomas and Hannah. The reason for her parents distancing from each other might have something to do with her father's possible slide towards criminality, with himself being accused of murder in 1838, when William Patrick was found hanging from a signpost at the crossroads at Lavrum. The last time he was seen alive was out drinking with William in the Cock Inn in Lavrum. All charges would later be dropped and the death was ruled a suicide. How much of this can be taken as true, though, is up for debate. Much seems to have been added to the family story as the years have gone on. For instance, also her grandfather has been accused of murder, but there is virtually nothing I can find on his story. On top of this, by the time the main events of this video unfold, William appears to have been dead. But for how long and what of, again, I could not find. Childhood was short in the 19th century, and certainly not comparable to anything we know today. And for a young woman like Catherine, the options were very limited. Aged 15, she entered service as a maid, first working for a Mr. Wade of Great Wallingfield in South Suffolk, a post she would hold for about a year, before moving on in July 1845 to the employment of a Mr. Bird, who lived in the village of Bulmer in Essex. Like all jobs available to the working poor in early Victorian Britain, the life of a maid was far from an easy one. Even in the best conditions you could hope for as one, the hours were long, waking long before her master and his family to get the home ready for them. The task she were given was often monotonous. Depending on the wealth of those who hired her, she could also be expected to double as a lady's maid, helping the lady of the house dress every morning, but most of the time she would be expected to keep out of sight. And when this was not possible, she was to be seen but not heard. Punishment for any seeming infraction on the rules of the house was swift, with it being fully legal until 1860 to beat a servant without any repercussions. Catherine's days off were few and far between, with some sources claiming she had as little as 1 day off a year. She would use this to go home and visit her family, and it's around this time that possibly she did hint at the idea that she'd like to be married, something that would prove near impossible given her age and working as a maid. It was generally the accepted notion at the time that a woman in maid service would wait until her early 20s before leaving to marry. But this was not going to be Catherine's life. She clearly couldn't stand what she was doing as a job, and by the end of September 1846, she returned to living with her mother and siblings, leaving the job well behind her. It is here that John Foster enters our story. Although in truth he had been known to Catherine for many years by this point, they had grown up in the village together and used to walk to school together often, with some describing them as childhood sweethearts, although it should be pointed out that John was 7 years older than her, with him even going to visit her a couple of times when she was in maid service. He was clearly very fond of her and was also very keen to marry, for no other reason than to get away from his current living conditions, sharing a house with his mother and 2 sisters, both of whom had illegitimate children and were probably the topic of much gossip around the village of Acton. For a pair like John, a farm labourer, and Catherine, an out-of-work maid, a small Suffolk village did not really leave them many options, and a marriage meant some level of financial security for her, and because of this it does seem her mother was very much a driving force getting her into this union. So, within a month of her return, the pair stood in All Saints' Church in Acton, ready to tie the knot. The wedding took place on Wednesday the 28th of October 1846, with them being married by Reverend L. Otterley, who, as was traditional at the time, gave the couple a Bible to mark the occasion with. And with this, Catherine became Catherine Foster. Now, for people of their social class at the time, the idea of going on a honeymoon would be a distant dream. So it's no shock that the next day John returned to working for Mr. Meekins, in the village of Chilton, a few miles down the road. Although, at least for him, he no longer had to return to his mother and sisters. He was now living with Catherine and her family. And what seems like a good living condition for people like them at the time, things seem to be very strange almost right away. Within a few days of marrying, Catherine announced to John that she was going to go away for a few days, to the village of Pakenham in West Suffolk. She wished to visit her aunt she had not seen in a while. In total, she would spend 10 days there, which does seem to be a rather extreme period of time for a woman at this time period to spend away from her husband after recently marrying. And unfortunately, whatever she did for these 10 days while in Pakenham is completely unknown now. But it does seem that when she returned, wheels were now in motion that would bring dire consequences to everyone involved. On the 14th of November 1846, she went to a chemist in the nearby town of Sudbury, owned by a Mr. Ely, although she would later point out that Ely was not there that day, and she was served by the shop boy he employed, where she purchased some arsenic, an alien concept now, but not something that would have raised too much worry at the time, as arsenic was used in a number of ways, from rat poison to make-up, and even in a process to preserve wood. And following this purchase, the next 3 days would pass as normal. The morning of the 17th of November 1846 came around like any other. John and Maria went off to their respective jobs, and Thomas went off to school. As for Catherine, much of her action that day is unknown, but in the late afternoon she went to visit her mother-in-law, where she spent some time and ate with her, before telling her she had to get home as she was making dumplings for dinner. In what I can only imagine was a very stereotypical mother-in-law kind of way, Catherine was asked if she made dumplings for John every night, to which she responded she didn't, but tonight was a special occasion. Things came to a head that evening when John returned from a normal long day at work, hungry and ready for dinner. He was greeted by Catherine, who was making suet dumplings and potatoes. On a side note, the English word for dumpling is actually of local origin, coming from Norfolk in about 1600s, believed to be a derivation on the Low German word for lump. After washing his hands and face outside, he sat down to eat with his wife and young brother-in-law at around 6 p.m. that evening. John had only taken a few mouthfuls when he suddenly fell very sick, being forced to rush outside again, this time to vomit. Unable to carry on, he made his way to his and Catherine's bedroom, which was located on the ground floor of the house, where he tried to sleep it off. About an hour later, Maria returned from her day of work of washing clothes around the village, when she was informed John was not feeling well. Shortly after, she went through to see him, bringing him a bowl of gruel which she had mixed some brandy into, hoping that it would settle his stomach a little. All it achieved was causing John to vomit further. Maria disposed of the mess, throwing it outside onto a dung heap, and went to bed. She was shortly followed by Catherine, who chose to sleep upstairs in her mother's room that night, rather than keeping an eye on her sick husband. As the sun rose the next morning, it revealed two very bad situations. First, John had not improved during the night. In fact, he was barely clinging to life. And their neighbour's chickens, who had spent the night pecking through the disposed of vomit, were now all dead. At 8 a.m, Catherine left the house. She was going to make the 2-mile walk to Long Melford to fetch Mr. John Roberts, a local physician. To say she didn't hurry was somewhat of an understatement. It took her 2 hours to make the trip there, over double the time it should have. Once she did finally get there, she gave a very lacklustre and vague description to Jones about what was going on, not even telling him she was John's wife, or even that John was being sick. Rather, she was telling him that she thought he was suffering from some problem with his bowels, and with the details she was giving, this led Mr. Jones to believe that it was a case of English cholera. There had been a small outbreak that summer in the area, so thinking it was still around was not a great shock. He gave her a mix of mercury, chalk and powdered rhubarb to help combat it, and told her he would call on John when he could. Exactly how much attention John was getting on his last day alive is not really known. Maria had to go out to work at about 10, and Thomas went off to school. Hannah seems to have just disappeared around the time Catherine returned from being a maid, so possibly she had to enter the service herself, or maybe she had fallen victim to the high child mortality rate at the time. I can find absolutely nothing on her. And sources do also say that Catherine returned home after her meeting with Jones, but how long it took her to return, and if she did any caring for John that day, is completely unknown. Thomas returned from school at about 2 p.m, and Maria finished work and returned home at about 3 that day, and by then it was clear there was nothing that could be done for John. Laying with his head on Maria's shoulders, he took his final breaths at around 4 p.m, aged 24. It was just a few minutes later his mother arrived to see what was going on. It would be at about 6 p.m. that Robert Jones appeared. He had come to do the follow-up and check on John as he had promised to do that morning. But now all he could do was pronounce him dead. While inspecting the body and the bed, he at first theorised that John had died of bilious diarrhoea. But how fast John had passed shocked him. He'd never heard of anyone dying so fast of what he thought was a cholera case. And he was not the only one shocked by this outcome. When he told the local coroner, he called immediately for a post-mortem on the body and that a full inquest into the death must be carried out. The inquest was held the following Saturday, in what at the time was the traditional place to hold such an event, the local pub, in this case the Crown Tavern in Acton. The inquest was quick to agree that something seemed off about John's death, and his body needed to be investigated further. In the time between his death and this Saturday, Robert Jones had already done a small autopsy on the body, removing parts of his intestine and stomach, which he kept in glass jars in order to examine them further, along with another local, Dr. E. W. Image, who was an expert on poisoning. They carried out 2 separate tests on the remains, and both showed that arsenic was in his system. The same tests were also carried out on a number of the chickens that had died the night of John's illness, and they also all showed traces of arsenic. This revelation took Jones totally by surprise, as it was not something he had ever even considered, and the pair were now investigating further. They immediately requested access to John's body to carry out further tests to try and prove their theory, only to find that in recent days he had been buried in Acton churchyard. So they were forced to get permission from the church first to exhume his body. While this was going on, Thomas Morley, Catherine's younger brother, was removed from the family home and sent to Boxford. Who he was living with there at the time I've been unable to find, possibly another relation, but he would remain there for 15 days before being allowed to return to his mother. Back at Acton Church, the exhumation of John's body went without incident, and as soon as the coffin was opened, the signs that he had been poisoned were obvious to Dr. Image. With this new evidence found, 2 constables from Melford, George Green and Sergeant Rogers, were sent to the Morleys' cottage on the 24th of November 1846, where they took samples of the muslin cloth and flour used in making the dumplings, sending them to Dr. Image for further tests. The flour was clean, but one of the cloths was found to contain traces of arsenic as well, although no poison was ever found in the property itself. But with no doubt left of the cause of death, Catherine was promptly arrested, putting up no struggle as she was. She was held in prison in Bury St Edmunds until the early months of the following year when her trial was to begin. While she was there, she was regularly questioned by local magistrates, all while under the watch of Mrs. James, the jailer's wife. At this point in history, courts were not a constant thing as they are today. They were only generally held a few times a year, something that had been done for centuries. In this case, the trial was held on the 29th of March, 1847, at the Bury St Edmunds Lent Assizes, overseen by Sir Charles Edward Pollock as a judge. A man who, if this picture of him captures him correctly, is not someone I would want looking down at me from a court bench. The prosecution was led by Mr. Gurdon, although some sources claim it was Gurney, while Catherine's defence was led by a Mr. Power. Catherine was described as being very calm throughout her trial, and from the outset pleaded not guilty to her crime in a firm voice, and seemed to be very confident despite the large amount of evidence against her, both in testimonials and in what at the time was the new field of forensics. At one point the defence tried to argue that John's death might have actually been connected to an accident he had at work a couple of weeks before. He had fallen from a cart while loading it and had been complaining about a pain in his side ever since, with Catherine saying he'd been very unwell the day before but had to go to work to earn money for them. This argument didn't hold much weight anyway, but it held even less following the testimony of 2 men who worked alongside John, James Pleasance and William Steed. They both claimed that he had been fine on his final day at work, and showed no signs of truly being unwell, other than a headache he was complaining about the day before his death, but was in good health when he was left at his gate by one of his work friends as they walked home together. They even dismissed the cart injury, saying that yes, it was true he had fallen, but he'd soon picked himself back up and carried on working. Although this does seem a place where both sides could easily be telling the truth, and John could easily have been playing off what could have been a bruised or cracked rib at the time. The star witness of the case turned out to be young Thomas, only 8 years old at the time. He explained what had happened that day the best he could, but also pointed out to the court that he didn't know exactly when things happened, as he didn't know how to tell time. He said John seemed to be in good health when they came home from school and from work for lunch that day, and John also appeared once again absolutely fine when he returned from work later that day for dinner. Catherine had prepared potatoes and dumplings for the family, but he had noticed that John's portion was being prepared away from the others, even coming from a different cloth when cooking. During the cooking process he'd also witnessed his sister take a small paper parcel and empty a dark-coloured powder into the pot before throwing what was left into the fire. It was only a few moments later that John fell ill. John's mother was questioned about her knowledge of the case and those involved. She spoke of her son's long relationship with Catherine, and meeting the defendant the day before her son's death. She also described the situation of when she arrived at the Morley property just shortly after her son's death, saying to the court, "I got there a little before 4 o'clock and found he was dead. His wife was sitting before the fire when I went in. Her mother, Mrs. Morley, was there. I spoke to the prisoner and said, 'Dear me, my poor child is dead. Did he ask for me?' She said, 'Yes, he did, 3 or 4 times, and also wished to see his sisters and brother.' And I said, 'And you never sent for me?' She replied, 'No. He was very bad, and I could not leave him, and there was no one to send for him.' I conversed with Mrs. Morley in her presence, who said he had been bad all night with purging, upwards and downwards, and that when she came from Sudbury she thought him very ill, but not dangerously so. She told me he died on her shoulder. When I was there, Mr. Jones, the surgeon, came in. It was about 6 o'clock. He asked the prisoner what her husband ate for supper, and she told him dumplings and potatoes. He asked what he'd had to drink, and she said, 'I made him some tea. My son was in very good health when he was with me.' The prosecution also made much that despite John falling so sick so fast, no one had alerted any neighbours, and no one had gone to fetch any help for over 12 hours. As the case went on, those brought in to testify ranged from family members of the deceased and the defendant, work colleagues, neighbours, including one Mary Ann Chinnery, who said she'd overheard Catherine talking with her grandfather shortly after she returned from visiting her aunt for the 10 days, which she confessed to him she now deeply regretted getting married. The court also spoke to a Mr. Samuel Newham of the West Suffolk Hospital, who was called in to verify the findings of Jones and Image. The defence led with there being no motive for Catherine to kill her husband. They'd only been married less than a month and appeared happy with each other, and ultimately Catherine had everything to lose and nothing to gain from such a course of action. Mr. Power also felt the case should be thrown out, due to what he saw as it being prejudiced. In the weeks leading up to the case, large numbers of handbills describing Catherine as cold and calculating had been passed around Suffolk, as well as pronouncing her guilty long before any evidence had ever been heard. He also made the argument that she and John were very much in love and had been for many years, as letters had been found in his room that she had been writing to him long before they married to each other. He also seemed supportive in what she was doing, and when she said she wanted to visit her aunt shortly after the wedding, he said she should go for a longer period of time, originally suggesting around a month, before she had opted for just the 10 days. When Maria was called to speak for her daughter, she does paint a slightly different picture of John. She stated that John had had much more than a passing interest in her daughter for some time, and had approached her when Catherine was about 14 years old, telling her that he was going to have her daughter. But Maria had put her foot down and told him that he had to wait until she was older. Not that this had stopped him, nor had her daughter finding work out of the village, with him even travelling to visit her often. Of course, it's important not to hold attitudes of nearly 200 years ago to the same standards of today, but this does show John as very much a driving force behind them getting together. The arguments of lack of motive and lack of reason from the defence seems to have done little to sway the jury, as it took them just 15 minutes to return with a guilty verdict. By this point it was around about 7 p.m. in the evening, and Charles Pollock called a recess until 9 a.m. the following day, as he felt it had dragged on long enough and he wanted to get home to have his dinner. We will never know how much of that evening he spent thinking the case and the evidence over in his mind, but by 9 a.m. the following morning he had clearly made his mind up. With the court assembled, he pronounced her guilty, donned the black cap, and condemned Catherine to hang for her crime. Catherine Foster, you have been found guilty of the crime of murder. It is sufficient to state that you were married on Wednesday the 25th of October. On the following Wednesday your husband died in consequence of the administration of poison. It is impossible to doubt that you prepared the food that you administered to him. It was your hand that put the poison in the food. Not only your hand did the deed, but your heart and your mind had meditated that act, and it was wilfully done for the purpose of producing death of the individual you so lately married, and towards whom, at the altar of God, you formed a connection, the most sacred and divine that any human can enter upon. I may add that I entirely concur with the verdict which the jury has pronounced, and it is my melancholy duty to pronounce the sentence of law against you, that requires your life should be forfeit for the crime you have committed. I would advise you to make the utmost use of the short time you will remain in this world, Seek peace and mercy where now alone you will be able to find them. It remains for me to pass the judgment of law, that you will be taken from this place from whence you came, and thence to the place of execution, and there to be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your body to be buried in the precincts of the prison in which you shall last be confined. And may the Lord, in his infinite mercy, have compassion on your soul. Catherine stood motionless, seemingly unaffected, other than dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. She was taken back to her cell to wait her execution that was to be carried out the following month. On the 12th of April she wrote a full confession of her crime. After much prompting from Mr. P. McIntyre, the prisoner's governor, it would later be published in a local paper after her death. Bury Jail, April 12th. To the Governor. First of all, I must confess that I am guilty, and very guilty of an awful crime, and well deserve the death I am condemned to die. And, as I am soon to stand before my heavenly judge, I wish to speak the truth. I am sorry to say that I brought poison from the shop of Mr. H. Ely, chemist, Sudbury, 3 days before I mixed it into the dumplings which I gave to my husband. It was served to me by a young man in the shop. Mr. Ely was not present. Had he been present, he would have known me, as I had been frequently at his shop on errands for my mistress when I was at service. The act was entirely my own. No person persuaded me to do it, and my mother had no knowledge or suspicion of it. I had no cause of complaint against my husband, who was always good and kind to me, but I never had any affection for him, and I wished to go back to service. I do not wish to live, for I could never be happy in this world, and I hope, through the merits and blood of my Saviour, and sincere repentance of all my sins, to obtain forgiveness of God, and to be received into heaven. I die at peace with all, having no complaint to make to any witness that appeared against my trial, and full for the crime which brings me to this premature death. I wish to express my grateful thanks to Reverend Mr. W. West, the chaplain of the jail, the kind Mr. Otterley, my parish minister, and Reverend Mr. Eyre, for their great attention to my eternal interests, and for the spiritual hope and consolation I have received from their instructions and admonition. I should wish Mr. Eyre to attend to my last moments, and earnestly request that he will do so. Signed, Catherine Foster. In more recent years, historians have called some doubt not only on this confession, but many of this kind, written privately after the case was done, and often used for little more than to prove the system worked. And although she said she had no qualms with John, some sources written since have claimed that she may have fallen in love with another man, but felt pressured to marry John, and seeing no other way out had to kill him. But how much truth is in this idea is very debatable. No evidence of another man was ever found. She spent much of her time in prison praying, and was often visited by the men she'd mentioned in her letter. Reverend Thomas West, the jail chaplain, Reverend Otterley, her parish priest and the man who had married her, and Reverend C.J.P. Eyre. During her final meeting with Otterley, she gave the Bible she had received from him on her wedding day, asking him to take it to John's mother, so she would have something to remember her son by. On the Thursday before her hanging, she was allowed a final visit with her mother and Thomas, and this seems to be one of the few times Catherine actually showed some regret of what was going to happen to her, and broke her always rather calm exterior. When Thomas offered her a bit of cake he'd brought with him, she snapped at him. "You good-for-nothing little boy, why did you tell such stories?" But other than this, it seems to have ended rather amicably between the group, and once again, towards the end, Catherine showing very little emotion. On Friday, the 16th of April, 1847, the final night of her life, she attended what was known as the condemned service in the prison chapel, led by Reverend Eyre, after which she once again asked him to accompany her to the gallows, and he assured her that he would be there. Her sentence was carried out on Saturday, the 17th of April, 1847, on Market Hill, at the time a meadow on the west side of the prison in Bury St Edmunds. The task was to be undertaken by the hangman William Calcraft, one of the country's most prolific hangmen, and the same man who the following year would end the life of James Blomfield Rush, the Stanfield Hall killer. He was also a notable drunk, who many believed enjoyed his work a little bit too much. The gallows that had been built were of the new drop type, designed to speed up the end of the condemned's life, although the death was still commonly by asphyxiation rather than breaking of the neck. Videos such as this one, and others I have done, and just the general common image we have of this period of time, could lead you to believe that hangings were incredibly common in every town and city over the country, but this was not the case. In Bury St Edmunds, this was the first hanging to take place in 20 years, the last being one also already covered on this channel, the famous Red Barn murder of 1827. And this might be one of the reasons it drew a crowd of over 10,000 people, many of whom were being described as well-dressed women who had brought their children with them, obviously using the day as some sort of morose lesson towards the children. Catherine also carries the distinction at this point of being the first woman hanged in the county for 47 years. She was escorted from her cell by the sheriff, prison guards and other officials, and Reverend C.J.P. Eyre. When she was called to stand up, she shuddered for a moment, before recovering and walking out with a firm step, ignoring all those around her. Upon reaching the steps of the gallows, one of the guards offered her his hand to steady herself with. She refused and climbed the stairs unassisted. This was the first time the crowd got a good look at her, and many were audibly shocked by her age. Others later commenting that her young age and the bright sunny day were both a stark contrast to what had to be done. As she moved into place, she looked around the throngs of people, and looked as if she wanted to make a statement. But when asked by the prison governor if she wanted to, now was the time, all she could reply was a meek, "No, I can't speak." Although others remember it differently. A book called Melford Memories that wasn't written until 1972. A local baker called Mr. Robert Bixby says that the story had passed down from a man that was there who had attended it with friends, that she gave a deeply moving speech. I've been unable to find anything about this speech, and it seems to have just been local rumour that grew up over the time and somehow ended up becoming part of the story for a time. When Calcraft was ready and everything was in place, the bolts were removed and the hanging itself took place at 9 a.m. And it would not be an instant death for Catherine. The fall didn't break her neck, instead leading her to struggle for several minutes, all while the crowd cheered and jeered, yelling murderer and shame at her. Described in the Bury Post newspaper at the time, her limbs were convulsed for a minute or so, and she plucked at her gown with her pinioned hands. A thrill of horror ran through the crowd. As with all hangings, Catherine was left to hang for an hour to ensure her death. After she was cut down, a plaster death mask was taken of her, although I haven't found any evidence that any copy survives to this day, and she was buried in the burial grounds of Bury St Edmunds prison. She was only 17 years old. It was during this process that a letter was found concealed in her clothes. She'd presumably written it that morning and intended it for her mother. "My dear mother, I never wrote to you with so much joy and pleasure in all the letters that I have wrote to you. Dear mother, you know I never had any wish to live, and I wish it had pleased the Lord to call me before I had known anything. My dear mother, I hope you will make yourself happy for me, for I'm going to a better place than this world of trouble, and I wished I'd been there 10 years ago. But I am glad to come to it. My dear mother, if my life could have been spared, I did not wish for it. This is from the bottom of my heart. I have a great hope that I am going to heaven, and there to see my Saviour face to face, and also the dear creature that I have injured, John, and the years that I might have spent in pleasure with him on earth. I hope I shall rest with him in heaven." The case of Catherine brought a lot of public attention and huge condemnation from the likes of the Marquis of Lansdowne, who raised the matter in the House of Lords. But there was little they could do after it was proved the trial and the hanging had been carried out in a proper manner. Anti-death penalty campaigners, though, were quick to jump on the case, publishing a pamphlet telling in their words how a young girl had been publicly strangled. Catherine's execution would of course have no bearing really on the end of the death penalty in Britain. It would carry on until 1964, and wouldn't be formally outlawed until 1998, but it was the manner of Catherine's death that would be listed among the reasons of the bringing to the end of public hangings in Britain. As many pointed out, whatever moral lessons authorities believed they were teaching were rather undone by the street hawkers, pickpockets, food sellers, and large jeering crowds who were there for a day out, many of whom later on went into the pubs and taverns, got drunk, and caused problems all over the local area. As you can see by the title of this video, Catherine holds the rather dubious distinction of being the last woman hanged in Suffolk, and given her age, she is one of the youngest hanged in the whole country. What makes this one of the strangest stories I've possibly ever covered on this channel is despite her confession in doing it, Catherine never said why she killed John. Of course, at the time of her death, divorce was not an option, and wouldn't be for another 10 years. Possibly there was more going on between the two than we know and she would ever admit to. If the trial took place today, John's actions would certainly be considered grooming and stalking at times. But if this is the case, why did she say in the letter to her mother that she hoped to see him again in heaven? This also disproves the theory there was another man in her life she'd fallen for, in my opinion. Another theory that occasionally floats around is John may have been killed for his money. But the earnings of a farm labourer in the 1840s would hardly have been something worth risking the noose to get your hands on. This leaves only one real option that it seems to me, and it does seem to line up with both what she said in her final letter and things she's clearly pointed out throughout her life. Catherine had often pondered her own death. In fact, she seemed to have welcomed it. And this whole fiasco may have ruined the work of a truly desperate young woman who could never see the point of carrying on. And during a time when taking her own life was unthinkable, this may have been the only way out she saw. And John just so happened to have made the moves on the wrong woman and was taken with her. Of course, this is all speculation and opinion on my part. But sadly, we will never know the full truth, if there is any more to this, than what Catherine said brought her to her end on that day in Suffolk. I promise you, the next presentation is going to be much more light-hearted than this. This became much darker than I ever thought it was going to be when I started writing it. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was Catherine Foster, the last woman hanged in Suffolk, and this was a little bit of history.